Okay. 18th of April, 2025. Dis&datInformation. We started yesterday with the first two chapters of Singularities. And I mean, it's interesting as a metaphor, and it even has quantitative capability. So that's kind of interesting to get at that idea. Of course, it's like other terms, they have certain limits in terms of explanatory or interpretive capability. So anyway, that's what we're going to do today. And then I'm going to, we're only doing chapter 3 because it's starting to get a little more, not so much dense, but there's concepts in it that I want not only myself to catch up with, but whoever's listening to this to catch up with. And I also wanted to overlay some other issues that are going to be part of how I'm going to carry on with this particular idea. So, Karpik's book, Valuing the Economics of Singularities, Princeton, 2010. Do we need another market theory, chapter 3? There's nothing new about questioning the limits of the neoclassical theory, although doing so has been and still is usually regarded by mainstream economics as a sign of ignorance or naivete. Two counter-arguments are generally advanced by orthodox economists to dismiss the charges that critics confuse the model with reality and overuse the term neoclassical theory, thereby demonstrating their ignorance of a complex and evolving body of knowledge. Now, in some cases, these reactions are justified, but that should not prevent us asking the following question. What discrepancy would make the concrete, peculiar marketplace unfit for neoclassical analysis? For orthodox economists, the question is literally meaningless since every marketplace, however impure and imperfect its information or competition may be, can only belong to the same theoretical framework. Distance and strangeness can never be transformed into exteriority. Such a proposition stems from an operation that is striking not so much for its complexity as for its simplicity. Far from being the result of a demonstration, the inseparable relationship between the unity of theory and the unity of reality is the product of a postulate that there is only one market model, and as a result, no market reality, however peculiar, can be external to it. Can this theoretical perspective account for singularities? A reasoned answer must break down the overly general term neoclassical theory into two categories. That is, mainstream economics and the quote-unquote new economics, as it was called when it appeared in the 1970s. The general question remains the same, but for each form of economics, the discussion is different. Now, what mainstream economics could only ignore, the countless definitions of neoclassical theory differ only by a few, usually minor stylistic features. The constitutive elements are always the same. A rational actor endowed with stable, ordered preferences, yeah, like Trump, and exclusively oriented toward profit or utility maximization. The regulation of supply and demand by price variations and market equilibrium states that are determined by the conditions of competition. The generality of the theory implies that the conditions of pure and perfect competition vary along a continuum. However far they may depart from the model, market realities can never escape it altogether. Since the theoretical model requires goods to be homogeneous, their choice by the consumers is based exclusively on one differential feature, price. Thus, this reasoning finds an exception in the products, as they may or may not be homogeneous. Now, what happens when the goods are not homogeneous? This issue was addressed by Edward Chamberlain in a book published in 1933, The Theory of Monopolistic Competition, in which he demonstrates that for differentiated goods, that is, goods particularized by any difference that represents a competitive advantage on the market, as well as for homogeneous goods, price theory retains its unity and its universal validity. Chamberlain was not the first to have noticed the extension of a new form of competition that expresses the relative capacity of firms to produce, in advance of their competitors, new commodities that are the source of monopolistic rents. But he was the first to resolve the problem he had raised. How can we explain a form of economic struggle that calls on both competition and monopoly? The solution was to consider each differentiated product as a homogeneous product associated with a very specific market. There are as many markets as there are differentiated goods. To analyze price setting for each homogeneous market, to link markets through price relations, and to identify the effects of the variety of products on prices. Now, the theoretical difficulty was thus resolved by converting differentiated goods into homogeneous goods. All paintings are the same. And the use of Hodeling's model, which transforms the degree of substitutability of differentiated goods into a more or less distant and continuous line, confirmed that these goods belong to a system of equivalences. Moreover, since differentiated and standardized goods alike are delineated, knowable, and known before purchase, the issue of product heterogeneity disappeared, and market theory could continue to coincide with price theory. Now, although the theory of monopolistic competition was often assimilated to a revolution because it combined two terms that had previously been not only separate but also opposed, and although the author himself regarded his approach as a new perspective, a new economic view, a new Weltanschauung, the change prompted by differentiation took place without any major clashes in the already existing body of knowledge, and so became an integral part of a neoclassical theory which, after having included differentiated goods, recovered its universal validity. In this theory, singularities cannot exist as singularities. To be taken into account, they must give up qualities, uncertainty, and incommensurability, and doing so amounts to a systematic process of dequalification that will transform them into differentiated goods, or else they must remain unexplained. The economics of singularities cannot be confused in any way with mainstream economics. Now, what the new economics chose to ignore. In the 1970s, uncertainty appeared in economic theory, where it progressively came to occupy a central position and to exert a major influence on the analysis of prices, products, economic coordination, and market equilibrium. Imperfect information replaced perfect information, and bounded rationality supplanted omniscient rationality. Products characterized by quality uncertainty became promises. Their evaluation was deferred until after purchase, and price setting, as well as the credibility of commitments, became problematic. The term new economics was applied to the new analysis, which was built around information and based on a particular view of uncertainty that applied to strategic uncertainty as well as to quality uncertainty. During the same period, the question of quality was also resolved by a theory of multidimensionality. We looked at that yesterday. The new economics thus integrated multidimensionality, quality uncertainty, and even to a lesser degree, incommensurability. This achievement raises two questions, which in reality are but one. Might not singularities belong to one of the new categories of products constructed by the new economics, even if that term singularity was not used? And if this is not the case, how do we explain that singular products were overlooked? Now, the first question justifies a comparative study of the use of the three terms, that is, multidimensionality, quality uncertainty, and incommensurability, while the second finds its answer in the analysis of a conflict that was present within the new economics from the beginning. Firstly, multidimensionality. To explain the relationship between the differences in prices and the quality of the goods, the usual solution was, and still is, to select a quality as a single dimension that would then become the common term of a ranking system. Now, different dimensions were usually chosen, such as reliability, warranties, price as an index of quality, and most often, reputation. This procedure brought multidimensional products into the sphere of generalized equivalences and thus into the neoclassical framework. But in the end, none of these methods met with general intersubjective agreement. None could lay claim to general validity. Now, the solution came from Kelvin Lancaster, uh, as I recall, a Brit. Uh, maybe not. His theory rests on the general assumption that consumers are not interested in the goods, but in their elementary components, their characteristics. Now, these are the sources of utility, use value, maybe even. And moreover, they are immutable, that is, independent of each other and can be combined with each other. They are the targets of individual ordered preferences. And because everybody shares this intersubjective agreement, they are, quote unquote, objective. Now, the list of characteristics for each good has to be exhaustive, but it could be simplified. Their relative value is set by the perfect competitive market and remains the same, whatever the goods in which this characteristic is embodied. Thus, a product is a quote-unquote bundle of characteristics, not unlike utility theory's budget, a util budget. And its global price is the sum of the prices of all its characteristics. The theory is general. Moreover, it can be easily applied to reality through the hedonic method. Lancaster seems to have succeeded in squaring the circle. He transformed the universal good into a multidimensional one, and he explained its global price by the sum of the prices of its characteristics. Subsequently, concrete studies have proliferated, but none has set any limits to the theory's validity. They exist, however, and it is crucial to identify them for the economics of singularities. I will compare two hedonic studies, hedonic, hedonic studies, one on housing and the other on fine wines. Of course, he does this without a blinking an eye on the difference between what counts as a fine wine and a not fine wine. But anyway, using econometric methods, the studies calculate the shadow prices, that is, the hedonic prices of the characteristics, that is to say, the relative contribution of each characteristic to the total price of the product. The two studies yield analogous formal results, but their meanings are completely different. The housing study uses a large database combining 17 different characteristics that enables the user to know the contribution of different elements, an additional room, a garage, a furnished kitchen, a balcony, or a garden, to the global price. Formally, the findings of the study on fine wines are no different. The wine characteristics include sensory qualities and the objective qualities printed on the bottle labels, that is, classification, appellation, that is, protected geographic designation, Bordeaux, Burgundy, whatever, Champagne, and year. If the classification and year come first for the relative contributions to the total price, the global price, taken alone, each sensory characteristic has very little effect on price. Thus, the taste characteristics have only a slight impact on the global price, while the inverse holds for the information on the labels. The consequences of this observation are crucial because information labels are not taste characteristics. They are indicators of quality, which is altogether a different reality. Now, the difference could easily be explained by the fact that a large majority of non-professional buyers are too ignorant in wine matters to recognize the sensory dimensions. But it's not really ignorance that explains why one sensory quality cannot be distinguished from another. It is the fact that sensory qualities are interdependent. Each one depends on all the others and cannot be separated from them. Consequently, the hedonic study of the wines does not explain anything. And the distinction between houses and fine wines is a distinction between divisible and non-divisible goods. In an inconspicuous remark, Lancaster foresaw the limits of his theory when he pointed out for indivisible and non-combinable products, we're in real trouble because the true shadow price may not become manifest in any form at all. The difference between houses and fine wines is the same as that found, for example, between cars and movies, and more generally, between differentiated goods and singular goods. All of them are multidimensional, but the first are aggregates of characteristics, and the second are structures of characteristics. Multidimensionality does not have the same meaning for all goods and services. Thus, Despite its true ingenuity, Lancaster's theory is not general. It's not valid for singularities. On to uncertainty. Sometime in the 1970s, quality uncertainty became the criterion for a new classification of products. This was a major change, but to give a realistic glimpse of its scale, we should consider some of the terms that are part of what has sometimes been called a revolutionary history. That is, the consumer's ignorance becomes an explanatory variable of their behavior. Their actions are considered as a more or less costly search. And heterogeneous entities such as friends and advertising can be combined to explain the variations in the available information. Consumer practices become a central object of study. The central issue was the notion of quality uncertainty. Different conceptions of it have arisen and may still arise. The debate has been and still is complicated. The presentation of the arguments will be limited to what seems necessary to identify the two general opposing conceptions, to explain how they have created a tension within the new economics, and to the consequences that have followed the victory of one side over the other. The easiest way to draw this picture is to compare the two conceptions as they have been expressed on the one hand by Philip Nelson, Michael Darby, and E.D. Carney, and on the other by Knight and Akerlof. Nelson makes a distinction between search goods and experience goods, to which Darby and Carney add credence goods and present a general definition of these terms. Search qualities are known before search purchase. Experience qualities are known costlessly only after purchase, and credence qualities are expensive to judge even after purchase. Their studies are guided by two main questions. Number one, how can consumers make reasonable choices when their information is uncertain? Number two, how can consumers protect themselves against seller fraud when the exchange entails experience goods, or when uncertainty is even higher, as in the case of credence goods? Nelson opened the way for consumer studies with his comparisons between different combinations of goods, experience goods and search goods, of information origins, that is, friends or personal experiences, social network, and of types of advertisement. Darby and Carney used the example of a repair service to show that in the case of credence goods, sellers have many ways of increasing their profit while decreasing the quality of the service. Now, that sounds like the end of the age of innocence. Williamson would soon show that opportunism, self-interest seeking with guile, is the omnipresent threat hovering over uncertain markets, like politics, and would study the means that may be mobilized to prevent market failure where we are now. Numerous economists would assess the relative effectiveness of the available means of protection: contracts, warranties, brands, advertising, public standards, repeat purchases, and seller reputation. Now, all these issues, notions, and analysis were based on the same conception of uncertainty. Now, another conception found expression when George Akerlof published the most famous article of the period. Now, let me break here for a second and tell you that I think it's this article. It went to 30 different journals and got rejected. Take that, Nobel Prize. Anyway, taking the example of the lemon market, that is the market for lemons, the used car market, he demonstrated that quality uncertainty combined with information asymmetry necessarily leads to market self-destruction. The only way to prevent this outcome is to rely on the action of counter institutions, that is, guarantees, brands, certifications, diplomas, professional licensing, intervention of the state and private institutions, and of course, trust. And then there's Fox News. In the absence of such mediations, the market collapses. Thus, under certain conditions, free competition leads to market self-destruction, while market continuity requires the regulation of competition. In sum, with quality uncertainty, continuity of the market, and free competition are at cross purposes. The very foundations of neoclassical theory are undermined. Now, here we have two opposing conceptions of uncertainty for Nelson, Darby, and Carney, and a large majority of economists. and entire business schools, uncertainty is moderate. It's more or less so, according to whether we're dealing with experience goods or credence goods. While for Akerlof, it's radical. Concrete expressions of this difference can be found in the consequences of uncertainty, that is, less efficient market equilibrium versus market self-destruction, where we are now, and in the means used to avoid them. The various measures compatible with free competition versus the arrangements which, like professional licensing or state intervention, not to mention the reference to trust, can only reduce free competition. Now, what is ruled out in one conception becomes necessary in the other. A prohibition respected by the first is lifted by the second. Although Akerlof does not explicitly refer to it, he is close to Knight's conception, formulated 20 years before, in which a distinction is made between probabilizable and therefore calculable uncertainty and non-probabilizable or radical uncertainty. The first being called risk, and the second, uncertainty itself. The prevailing conception in the new economics is that of a continuous and moderate uncertainty that entails risk and maintains the possibility of calculating the most rational decision. This possibility no longer exists with radical uncertainty. In this sense, singularities are an inheritance from Knight and Akerlof. Risk and uncertainty are not only two different conceptions, they're also two competing conceptions. In the past, a large majority of economists were busy excluding the radical conception of quality uncertainty. I will present briefly three operations that have led to this exclusion. First, repeated critiques of Knight's theory made it possible to end the distinction between risk and uncertainty so that the world of new economics is turned into the empire of risk. Second, a generalized reinterpretation of Akerlof's article resulted in the replacement of quality uncertainty by information asymmetry. The latter notion, information asymmetry, linked to moral hazard and adverse selection, applies to risk and thus becomes to occupy a core theoretical position. But information asymmetry is not indispensable from quality uncertainty to produce its effects. And Akerlof's demonstration of the inverse relationship between market continuity and free competition remains embarrassing. Third, rejection of quality uncertainty can take the extreme form of dissimulation. In certain presentations of Akerlof's article, the notion is purely and simply passed over in silence. The reader of these articles must wonder what aberration led the future Nobel laureate to include the word in his title. The fact remains that, with this discarding disappearance practice, the reality characterized by this form of uncertainty becomes invisible. In other words, singularities could not and still cannot exist. Now, no history is without surprises. What happened with quality uncertainty explained three mutually reinforcing consequences. First, a few economists among Knight's and Keynes's descendants have clung to the conception of radical uncertainty. Second, the revival of radical uncertainty came unexpectedly from, heterodox economics, particularly the economics of conventions, and from a few sociologists. Third, some of the economists and sociologists who have conducted empirical research have justified the notion of radical uncertainty. This is the case of Caves, who organized his study around the nobody knows property rule, by which he meant that there was no means of predicting the success of a product of the culture industry. As a result, he considered creative products as quote-unquote experience goods that depend not on the asymmetry of information, but on the symmetry of ignorance. Those big-eyed paintings. Writing on the movie industry, Devaney is even more adamant. Quote, there really is nothing that is predictable, not cost, not performance value, and certainly not revenue. And again, quote, movies, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, stock market returns, innovations and patents, and just about any really important phenomenon in human affairs are almost completely unpredictable. Just as there are no typical hurricanes or earthquakes, there is no typical movie. Now, the same observation holds for French lawyers, which he only left that as a footnote, but I think it means a lot more than that. And yes, you can all go back to your Bourdieu and read about that. Not really. The exchange of singularities is linked to radical uncertainty. As a result, no knowledge, calculation, or contract can dissipate it. Something more has to be added, which is trust. Because the universe of singularities is defined by radical uncertainty, the complete notion will be recalled from time to time, but usually the term uncertainty alone will be employed. And the next section, incommensurability. Although incommensurability could not logically exist in a universe of generalized equivalences, it is by no means absent from the new economics. It features, for example, in Williamson theory, in the form of the asset specificity idiosyncrasy. In the form of the asset specificity idiosyncrasy. More generally, nothing forbids adding it to subjective preferences. It thus partakes of the magical operation by which, although present at the level of individual behaviors, it disappears in the supply and demand formation processes, which appear at the collective level in the full objectivity of price formation. Now, to avoid such obliteration, the economics of singularities has to show, for example, how pricing is related to the primacy of quality competition. Now, comparisons of these three above notions shows that neither multidimensionality nor quality uncertainty nor incommensurability has the same meaning in the new economics and in the economics of singularities. Singular products cannot be confused with experience goods, credence goods, or differentiated goods. Singular products are an irreducible reality. Singularity is not a strange meteor fallen to Earth by accident. The interpretation I propose shows that the history of the new economics has been built on the tension between creations and exclusions, with the latter probably being necessary to the former. Those who rejected the radical version of quality uncertainty also eliminated singularities. Only a different point of view could discover them, name them, subject them to analysis. If we add that Lancaster's conception of product does not apply to singular goods, we must conclude that some goods and some services which share common features are not amenable to neoclassical theory. Two examples, paintings and movies, confirm this. Comparison of paintings shows that even the few that have long been the object of a collective and universal worship, Mona Lisa, which should have exempted them from subjectivity, conserve the quality uncertainty that might jeopardize their artistic value either in the event of a deattribution or when there has been a change in the public's taste. Comparison shows, too, that their incommensurability cannot be reduced to the objective determination of shared or different characteristics, and that these paintings are unique totalities which elude all attempts at objective classification. But this impossibility disappears when it comes to classifications drawn up by people sharing the same point of view. Incommensurabilities thus prohibit neither reasoning nor acting, but they cannot furnish the bases of a general theory whose first requirement would be to make them equivalent entities, that is, to require them to give up precisely that which makes them desirable. Comparison shows, last of all, that competition bears fundamentally on aesthetic qualities because buyers are looking for a quote-unquote beautiful picture, whatever concrete meaning they want to put on the term. Speculators aside, price is not the fundamental criterion of choice for lovers of art. The same analysis applies to widely shared ordinary experiences, movies, for instance. First of all, each movie represents a particular configuration of qualities that includes actors, script, music, construction of the work, rhythm, character development, entertainment value, metaphysical depth, seat comfort, quality of the copy, admission price, and cinematographic style. The configurations are incommensurable. They are worlds of meanings that are constantly being rated by moviegoers and which nevertheless constantly resist an objective classification whose validity would be indisputably obvious to all. Die Hard is a Christmas movie. Viewers go to see a good movie, whatever they mean by the term, usually without even knowing the admission prices in the different theaters. As a result, quality competition prevails over price competition. And promotion notwithstanding, the success or failure of movies remains unpredictable. Now, that's the chapter 3. It has a lot of stuff in there. That's why I'm only doing one chapter. But it's a lot to think about because of the differences among certainty and uncertainty, certain views of rationality, the general conception of uncertainty, the general conception of rationality. And I think that you can see that the so-called new economics or mainstream economics, the current mainstream economics, has certain limits. And in some ways, it's limited by its math, but that's a whole nother story. And so there are footnotes here, and that include Joe Stiglitz's article, Chamberlain's article, a variety of really good articles, and I mean classic articles, and people like Williamson. There's an entire field built, well, one field built around Williamson, and et cetera. And yes, you have entire bodies of business school curricula built around consumer theory, for example, that drives, for example, marketing, and not in a good way at one level. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. And so without fully ending, because I know I've left time for myself, I wanted to introduce, and because, one of my favorite things to read, because I have no life, is the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. And I wanted to include, because I mentioned it before, I've actually did one little thing on analytic Marxism, and I assume everyone has forgotten it. And so I'm going to do another little thing or review some of it, because this is going to come back for us only if there are people who have reified or reduced or overdetermined the concept of analytical Marxism and boiled it down to only one author, when in fact it is a school of authors. It's a bunch of them, and it is not just one thing, but many different things. Uh, and in fact, it is no different than certain other things that I would assert that Marx and Engels have actually already plowed the ground on. But some people refuse to admit it for a variety of reasons. Analytical Marxism is a predominantly Anglophone. Yes, it is. It's mainly people doing this in English, but there are really some good contributions done by other folks from Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc. Anglophone variety of Marxism that emerged in the late 1970s. Oh, yes, and the Japanese, and whose leading proponents are located in philosophy and social science departments in the US and European universities. It can be distinguished from certain classical forms of Marxism by its openness to analytical methods, its critical attitude to certain substantive Marxist claims, its acknowledgement of its own normative commitments, and its assertion of the need for socialist design. Now, the arrival of analytical Marxism is often dated by the appearance in 1978 of Karl Marx's theory of history of defense by Jerry G.A. Cohen from Canada. This particular label seems to have been coined by John Elster, who is, I think, still alive, yes, and first appears in print as the title of a collection published in 1986 and edited by John Romer, also still with us. Those three figures, Cohen, Elster, and Romer, are plausibly seen as the founders of analytical Marxism as a self-conscious intellectual current. The label analytical Marxism requires some unpacking, needless to say. Its component terms obviously get used in a wide variety of ways, and the combination looks an unnatural one to some. Analytical Marxism often describes itself as the self-conscious product of Marxist and non-Marxist traditions, and the analytical modifier is provided by the latter. Non-Marxist is intended as a neutral descriptive term. It is not, for instance, equivalent to the pejorative use of un-Marxist by what equally pejoratively might be called true believers. This suggests, of course, the obvious ideological biases that occur in the fights that occur in our academia. This dual inheritance takes a very particular form. Analytical Marxism is not a miscellaneous assembly of Marxist and non-Marxist elements, but rather embodies a distinctive division of labor between these two. So, structure, section 1.2, the division of labor internal to analytical Marxism, runs between, on the one hand, its non-Marxist analytical methods, the plural is important, methods, and on the other, its Marxist substantive concerns and normative commitments. I might note here that everybody has normative commitments, even if you claim you don't. It's even if you're a libertarian, for example. Perhaps the only methodological commitment that analytical Marxists share is a negative one. They deny that there exists a distinctive and valuable Marxist method, one which is both useful and exclusive to Marxism, that is unavailable to non-Marxists. Analytical Marxists adopt non-Marxist mainstream methods whenever and wherever appropriate. Gee, heterodoxy. And they maintain that to the extent that, historically speaking, Marxism rejected a range of analytical methods on the ground of their putatively non-Marxist, undialectical, or individualistic character. This was to the detriment of Marxism's engagement with its own substantive and normative concerns. The positive methodological commitments of analytical Marxism vary significantly, and some generalizations about aspirations to precision or rigor in argumentation, for instance, are not especially illuminating. That said, characteristic, if not constitutive preferences organized by discipline and associated with Cohen, Elster, and Romer, respectively, would include, in philosophy, those standards of clarity and rigor associated with the techniques of logical and linguistic analysis that predominated in the Anglophone philosophical world in the 20th century. So that's the Anglophone philosophical world is sort of Anglo-American philosophy of a variety of types. That is both analytical or analytic philosophy and language philosophy of a variety of sorts. Mainly, and of course, epistemological kinds of concerns. Mainly, I mean, the whole social ontology thing is also part of that, as it were. In politics, political science treatments of action, choice, and strategy, especially those which utilize decision theory or rational choice theory. And in economics, the major contributions of neoclassical economics, which we just started yakking about above, especially the mathematical modeling of general equilibrium, and yes, asymmetric information, cooperative game theory. Whether these various methods have much in common is not certain. Eric Olin Wright suggests that they share a commitment to conventional scientific norms, an emphasis on the importance of systematic conceptualization, a concern with fine-grained specification of theoretical arguments, and a willingness to take the relationship between social processes and the intentional actions of individuals seriously. The substantive concerns of analytical Marxism are broadly shared with classical forms of Marxism. They consequently range widely, but certainly include an interest in historical explanation, class structure, and exploitation. What is potentially distinctive here is the analytical Marxist treatment of those and other classical Marxist topics. The normative commitments of analytical Marxism are also broadly shared with classical forms of Marxism. The status and role of normative commitments in Marxist theory are much argued about, but it seems certain that whatever their preferred self-descriptions, Marxists do have characteristic normative commitments. Yes, indeed. What is potentially distinctive here is that analytical Marxists acknowledge this and see a need for further reflection on the relevant values and commitments. Analytical Marxists typically embrace values associated with socialism, such as equality and community, and endorse normative claims, such as that existing capitalism is flawed and that some non-capitalist alternative would be preferable. More generally, this preliminary division of Marxism into elements, some of which can be rejected and others improved upon, reveals a further characteristic feature of the understanding and approach of analytical Marxism. In their various critical reflections on what is living and what is dead in classical Marxism, for instance, Elster, 85, analytical Marxists typically resist treating Marxism as a theoretical entity so systematic that can only be swallowed or rejected as a whole. Section 1.3, bullshit. In trying to characterize an intellectual current, it can help to identify those it is opposed to or consciously contrasts itself with. So, yes, and this is significant because some people, were personally, sort of injured by this discourse, and I think more productive things could have been done, but some people, they've chosen their enemies or they've demonized various elements. Cohen, Elster, and Romer all participated in an annual workshop usually known as the September Group. That group initially also referred to itself as the Non-Bullshit Marxism Group. The label is intended both to be humorous. There was even a faux heraldic crest, complete with a cod Latin tag, Marxismus sine stericor tauri, Marxism without the shit of the bull, and to convey some truth. It is also an aggressive characterization in that it implies some kinds of Marxism are of the bullshit variety. The best known philosophical discussion of bullshit is, of course, that of Harry Frankfurt. It's a classic book, 2005. It's in hardcover, so you can always give it to somebody who you don't like, mainly. Cohen extended Frankfurt's pioneering analysis to a variety of bullshit neglected in the latter's original essay, a variety which naturally inhabits the academy and not ordinary life, consists of the output, that is the bullshit, and not the process, the bullshitting, is related to the OED, the Oxford English Dictionary, definition of bullshit as nonsense or rubbish, and which further specifies the relevant nonsense as being, by nature, unclarifiable. It is the last of these characteristics, the unclarifiable unclarity, which appears central to this variety of bullshit and which is purportedly, celebrated by some of its producers and consumers. Cohen goes on, I think that's why Ben Burgess likes to talk about analytical Marxism. Cohen goes on to affirm and defend the historical and empirical claim that bullshit Marxism flourishes in French intellectual culture. Yes, we're redoing the whatever it is, the 30 Years' War, whichever war it was, the Napoleonic War. He had just judged the second part of his discussion as too speculative, and it was only published posthumously. In the 1960s, he read a great deal of French Marxism, especially work by Louis Althusser and his followers. At the time, Cohen found much of that material hard to understand, but located the blame for these difficulties entirely within himself. Moreover, whenever he finally managed to extract a reasonable idea from this Althusserian literature, he was inclined, precisely because of that effort and investment, to consider it a more important and interesting one than it actually was. This psychological mechanism, a blend perhaps of adaptive preference formation and cognitive dissonance reduction, may be widespread. Despite this youthful attraction, Cohen did not succumb to Althusserianism because, as he puts it, I came to see that its reiterated affirmation of the value of conceptual rigor was not matched by conceptual rigor in its intellectual practices. Well, yes and no. And Cohen explicitly identifies this youthful, misguided Althusserian dalliance as lying behind his own subsequent and fierce intolerance of bullshit. The same phenomenon, the Althusserian promise of theoretical rigor and the purported failure to deliver it in practice, may also have found biographical expression in John Elster's early graduate career. Not feeling at home with the Althusserian Marxists at the École Normale Supérieure, Elster ended up writing his dissertation under Raymond Aron, who has a very different kind of Marxism, with all due respect. In a distinct but related account, Eric Olin Wright characterizes full-blown bullshit Marxism as beset by three intellectual sins. First, obfuscation, understood as offering arguments and analyses which sound profound, but which are resistant to clarification. The objection here is not to the use of technical or quasi-technical vocabulary as such, but rather to its use to obscure. Second, intellectual dishonesty, understood as the refusal variously to clarify arguments in ways that are open to challenge, to acknowledge gaps in one's understanding or knowledge, or to concede that there exist reasonable grounds for disagreement. Now, this can take the form of what might be characterized as sincere dogmatism. See the Catholic Church, but more often involves something closer to bad faith, in which authors repress their genuine doubts and qualifications when presenting their own views in public. The third is an ideological style of argumentation in which a correct understanding of a subject is conflated with Marx's understanding of that subject, that Marx endorsed such and such a claim being treated as a conclusive argument in its favor. Wright's account of bullshit is more expansive than Cohen's, not least in venturing into the character of the bullshitter, but the idea of obfuscation looks to be a close relative of unclarifiable unclarity. Note that the distinction between bullshit Marxism and non-bullshit Marxism is not an exhaustive one. That is, there are varieties of Marxism which are neither analytical or bullshit. However, Cohen does provocatively suggest that once analytical Marxism has a clear presence in the world, what might be called pre-analytical Marxism is no longer a stable outcome. It must tend to either becoming analytical or become bullshit, as the case may be. Well, anyway, I like that just simply because, you've got to call a spade, and, we're all, I've been at conferences where there's just bullshit, and you've got to kind of not necessarily call it out, but sort of go, okay, well, that was bullshit. And then you got to move on and just move on and not make a big deal out of it, because there's always going to be problematic discourse elements. Section 1.4, further disambiguation. Analytical Marxism, so understood, is not to be confused with adjacent intellectual movements that have shared the same or closely related label and with which they may have some affinity. Now, two earlier and non-Anglophone examples might be noted here. First, a Japanese school of Marxist economics, also known as analytical Marxism, developed in the 1930s and was associated with the work of Shibata Kei and others based at Kyoto University. Shibata pioneered the critical use of tools in modern neoclassical economics to the problems of Marxist economics, in particular contributing to a mathematical theorem which maintains that the viable innovations in production methods will only increase or maintain the equilibrium rate of profit. Second is a Polish school of analytical linguistic Marxism associated with the work of Adam Schaff and Władysław Krajewski in the 1960s. It is said to have resulted from a collision between Marxism and the Polish tradition of analytical philosophy, and involved, in particular, attempts to incorporate analytical tools into Marxist treatments of semantics and epistemology. And it's quite significant and still worth studying, if not just for that, but because of the other elements that come from Polish analytical linguistic studies. And these and other adjacent movements are not discussed further in this entry. There's just so much more to read. Section 2. Yes, I'm almost done. We're almost at the end time, so hang in there. History, 2.1, origins. This is not the place for a thorough historical account of analytical Marxism, certainly not. However, it might be helpful to say something about its origins in relation to the annual workshop of the September group. Remember, there were Decembrists, etc. This all has a Marxist subtext, needless to say. Analytical, Octobrists, etc. Analytical Marxism is sometimes conflated with participation in the September group. This is both understandable and unfortunate. It is understandable because of the close overlap between the two. Many of the best-known analytical Marxists, including the founding trio, ghostly trio, were participants in the group. And it is unfortunate because the two entities are distinct. Their fates may often have overlapped, but they're not synonymous. First, analytical Marxism existed prior to and independently of the September group. Each of the three founding figures had put analytic methods, and Marxism together in their own work before they met the other two. And you can see this in, for example, working papers by Romer when he was at UC Davis before he went to Yale, et cetera, et cetera. Similarly with Cohen and Elster. Biographically speaking, and understanding their positive response to analytical methods, it may also be significant that these three founding figures learnt their Marxism independently of and prior to their exposure to the analytical methods of their respective academic disciplines: philosophy, sociology, statistics, and economics and political science. Thus, Cohen and Romer were independently raised in North America by pro-Soviet parents, while Elster came from an intellectual left-wing family associated with the Norwegian Labour Party. Oh, darned family ties. Second, much analytical Marxist work is by individuals who are not participants in the September group. A list of some of these drawn from assorted secondary literature might include Alan Carling, Norman Yaros, Andrew Levine, Daniel Little, Richard Miller, Charles W. Mills, Richard Norman, Jeffrey Ryman, Deborah Satz, David Schweikart, William Shaw, Tommy Shelby, Elliot Sober, Ian Steedman, Nicholas Versailles, Robert Paul Wolfe, not to be confused with Rick, and Ellen Wood. All of those have been characterized as producing work at some point in the analytical Marxist mode, albeit that the list includes individuals who would not identify themselves as analytical Marxists, and others who have themselves criticized narrower versions of the tradition, such as rational choice Marxism. Some will also think that the relevant conflation mistaken because the September group is a diverse grouping of analytical Marxists and fellow travelers. Fellow travelers is intended here non-pejoratively to refer to individuals sympathetic to and intellectually cooperating with, but not themselves identifying either as analytical Marxists or indeed as Marxists of any stripe. It might appear counterintuitive to characterize these fellow travelers as analytical Marxists, but the present entry operates on the basis of an expansive notion of analytical Marxism, which includes all those working in the relevant mode, both fellow travelers in the September group and non-participants in the September group, and attaches no special weight to self-identification. See, this is that kind of tribal problem that always comes up at every conference. It comes up in every conversation. You need to sort of get a handle on where people come from. It's not let 100 theories bloom or whatever. Anyway, I've exceeded my time. I'm going to stop now. You can look this up yourself on in the Stanford Encyclopedia, or else you can come back to this page, which I'll post at the end. Singularities, the entire text you'll find up in our sort of little reading library. And let's see if there's any brickbats or comments. People came and went. Bullshit. I want the T-shirt. The shit to the bull. Yeah, we should do that. The Latin. Get in trouble at a conference. Just to even call Marxism bullshit is probably get you in trouble. Normative commitment, yes, yes. Normative commitments, of course, yes. Psychoanalytical Marxism versus Western Marxism. Western Marxism is not the same. Psychoanalytical is a subset, perhaps, of Western Marxism. Symmetry of ignorance. Yes. When has there been change in public taste vis-a-vis Mona Lisa? There was a change in public taste on the Mona Lisa relative to its entry into popular culture, like when idiots started stealing it. You get this radical shift in works of art like that. In fact, currently they're going to move the Mona Lisa to some other location to give it its own building or some other wackiness. And if you've ever actually seen the damn thing, you're stuck in a room of a crowd of people all shooting pictures of the damn thing, and there's no way that you can get close enough to actually deal with it because of all these weird other iconoclastic and strange attacks on the painting itself. And no one ever explains Sfumato or anything for it. Okay, let's see. Any Port in a Storm, Experience Goods, Donald Pleasance, Columbo. Yes, there's a Columbo episode on wine. Anyway, um, that being said, let me thank everyone for their attention and return us to our regular stuff. Suzanne will be presenting a thing tonight, and we will be grateful for that. We will not be with Prof. John, I think, in terms of the Night Gallery episode because he has other commitments. I'm hopeful that Walter will be with us tonight, and Joe will actually be cooking something tonight because where he is staying has graciously allowed us their kitchen, and it is so it should be a fun time at 7 o'clock. And as I say, there will be different things tonight, but there will be things. And later this weekend, I've moved weekly marks to 2 p.m. Eastern Time on both Saturday and Sunday. Um, I don't recall what's going to be shown on Saturday. And on Sunday, I think we will have more at 5. Um, and after that, music. And at 5, though, there will be Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Yes.
Now I will stop share. And now